morning and welcome to One Intelligence. As part of One Business World, One Intelligence presents market insights and business intelligence on cutting-edge topics and the latest in industry developments. Our goal is to provide the members of the global business and entrepreneurial communities with access to knowledge, information, and insights that can help them make better decisions towards a better business world. Today, we're very pleased to welcome back global market strategist and thought leader, Henning Stein. Henning is the global head of thought leadership and market strategy at Invesco. Henning, great to have you here with us this morning again, your afternoon in Europe. And we very much look forward to hearing more about innovative nutrition in your One Intelligence talk today. Let me hand it off over to you. Welcome. Great to see you again.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Glenn. And I'm here, as you said, to talk about nutrition. Please don't log off if you think you're about to be lectured on your diet, because this concerns something much farther reaching. And how we think about nutrition will be key to creating a new, genuinely sustainable food system. In turn, a new food system will be vital to meeting a range of global challenges. These include climate change, environmental decline, hunger, undernourishment, poverty, many other issues that encapsulated in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And the point I'm trying to make from the outset is that nutrition isn't just an individual concern. It's not simply a matter of what you or I eat. It's a problem with worldwide consequences. And it's also an example of how the challenges confronting our planet, its inhabitants, are really closely linked with each other. It's a phenomenon known as interconnected causality. Interconnected causality means that if you can make progress on nutrition, if you can radically reshape how we think about it, then we can expect progress in all the areas linked to it. And so make no mistake, this matters. It matters in terms of serving the greater good. It also matters in terms of growth opportunities that arise from these game-changing innovation. And that's another connection we need to take into account from the start. The brightest hope for tackling every global challenge, nutrition included, lies in technology. Whether you are an established business, an entrepreneur, an investor, you can play a part in tech-driven, I call it tech-driven nutrition, tech-driven nutrition revolution that's already unfolding. So let's take a closer look at it. Let me start by setting the scene with some broader context. I think it would be useful to give you a kind of bigger picture of the challenges around nutrition and the food system in general. Historically, at least in relatively modern times, changes in the food and in the agricultural sector have mainly been driven by two things. First, population growth, and second, evolving consumer preferences. We might say the sector has responded to these dynamics pretty well. It hasn't always produced enough, but it has consistently produced more of whatever has been required or desired. Yet the serious long-term problem hasn't gone. Quantity has not gone hand in hand with quality. Food production has generally risen over time, but the nutritional value, in fact, of food has fallen. As the result, what has been described as the great nutrient collapse is now thought to have been underway for around 3/4 of a century. That's quite interesting. In 2004, a landmark study, in fact, found nutrient levels in most fruits, in most vegetables, have declined since 1950. The authors said high-yielding crop varieties actually introduced after World War II were probably to blame. Other researchers have since blamed carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So more CO2 basically means more photosynthesis, which means plants are packing in more carbohydrates and fewer nutrients. Whatever the cause, the effects are clear. A tenth of global population was undernourished in 2020, meaning a healthy diet is beyond the reach of hundreds of millions of people. And the only realistic way of really reversing this trajectory is to invest in businesses operating in areas such as plant-based food, healthier products, and of course, agricultural R&D. Keeping all that in mind, here's the ground we are going to cover in the next 25 minutes or so. As you can see, what follows is divided into 3 parts. First, we will go beyond the broad context I just outlined, examine some of the specific trends that are driving change in the space. Second, we will take a closer look at why technology and radical innovation are so important in tackling the challenges around nutrition. Third, we will explore some of the most innovative technologies that are redefining how we can make food more nutritious and accessible to all. In doing so, we will look at some of the companies already providing novel solutions. Crucially, these businesses include established large caps, but also smaller firms that are rapidly gaining traction. So, what are the trends driving the need for innovation in nutrition? I think an obvious starting point in answering this question is to recognize the world has been through a lot in the past few years. Most recently, of course, Ukraine and Russia. That affected, of course, commodity prices. These went up by more than 12% in just the first months of the war alone. And in turn, food prices have risen dramatically. In March 22, they were nearly 35% higher than a year earlier. As a result, millions more people are struggling to maintain healthy diets. The invasion of Ukraine obviously came hot on the heels of the COVID-19 crisis. The shocks the pandemic inflicted on food systems around the world are still being felt today. A World Bank study found the number of undernourished adults rose from 83 million to 132 million during the crisis. Food insecurity also worsened, especially among the poor. Yet nourishment levels were actually falling even before the pandemic. So in 2017, after many years of improvement, the prevalence of undernourishment globally began to increase. So obesity has been on the rise as well. Levels have tripled globally since 1975, with childhood obesity increasing tenfold during the same period. We also need to consider some dynamics that are more positive. For example, policymakers are paying more attention to the impacts of fertilizer use, including effects on human health. New rules introduced in the European Union earlier this year are typical of intensifying regulation in this space. Businesses will increasingly need to innovate in order to comply, and the innovation dimension is also apparent in rising demand for personalization across multiple sectors. This trend very much encompasses nutrition and health. Younger consumers, in particular, are becoming more health conscious. This is reflected in a greater desire for wearable technologies that help shape tailor-made exercise and diet solutions. Finally, especially in developed markets, consumers are aligning their food preferences with climate consciousness and ethical consumption. And this shift is fueling greater demand for alternative sources of nutrition. Again, businesses will need to innovate in order to keep pace. Let's quickly illustrate some of these points, beginning with food prices. You can see here the sharp uptick since 2020, a result of the macroeconomic pressures brought by the pandemic and the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Here we can see how a promising trend of improving nourishment levels globally began to unravel in 2017, as I mentioned, and has then deteriorated since. The figures for this year are expected to be worse again. And here's a snapshot of growing demand for personalized nutrition. The market has or was worth just over $1 billion in 2020, but it's expected to be worth more than 3 times as much in 2025. So how do we meet these challenges? I have to admit at this point that I'm really frustrated when I hear policymakers telling people how to live their lives. It's true, each of us can make a difference, but the most effective way to meet any global challenge is not to rely on marginal gains from the combined actions of individuals. For example, we are not going to transform the global food system by ordering everyone to eat spinach or lentils. I mean, I say this even though I'm vegan, by the way, but it doesn't work. So the solutions that lies in technology. It's simple. Technology can change everything. It's technology that's redefining what's possible in almost any field we can think of, nutrition included, of course. Let me read you a quote from the United Nations Systems Standing Committee on Nutrition. That's the organization responsible for unifying food and nutrition policy worldwide. The committee has said technological innovation can help, and I quote, transform food systems and assist in the design and delivery of food and nutrition measures. The committee has also said this transformation is likely to translate into 3 key benefits, which you can see on the slide here. The first is greater access to health and nutrition data that can improve insights into existing and future nutrition trends. The second is enhanced traceability. This will provide retailers and consumers with more transparency around the origins and nutritional content of food products. And the third is a growing range of novel processes for producing food that has a high nutritional content and it's available to all. As businesses, as entrepreneurs, as investors, we need to identify, finance, and scale up the technologies that can accelerate the necessary disruption. So let's look at a few of them. I'm going to zero in on 5 particular innovations that are likely to be key enablers of improvements in nutrition. Each falls within one of 2 broader categories. The first broader category is food tech, food technology, and the second is agtech, agricultural technology. Those are fundamental to the radical reform of the global food system. Let's examine each of our 5 chosen innovations in turn, explaining what they are, how the market for each is expected to develop, and which companies are leading progress. Synthetic biology is a fast developing field of biotechnology. It combines engineering, design, and computer science principles with biology to develop organisms for new purposes. Key breakthroughs include crops that have no allergy triggering proteins in their DNA. There are now also several novel processes to develop plant-based and lab-grown meat. One of these processes is called precision fermentation. This is a state-of-the-art way of programming microorganisms to then produce specific proteins, enzymes, vitamins, fats, and other ingredients. In 2000, it costs around $1 million to produce a single kilogram of one type of molecule through this kind of method. It now costs around $100, and it's likely to cost less than 10 in just a few years. So that gives you an idea of how dramatically advanced this space is already and how it's proceeding. It also gives you an idea of the threats faced by companies that refuse to change, as the chart clearly shows. Some estimates predict the synthetic biology market will be worth more than $100 billion by 2030. By any estimate, this is a market that's ripe for growth. One of the interesting small to mid-cap size businesses in the space is Codexis. It's a protein engineering company that's working with partners such as Tate & Lyle to develop healthy sugar alternatives. There's also, of course, Beyond Meat, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. It's pea protein-based Beyond Burger, which mimics the taste of meat and contains almost no cholesterol, is now available in more than 50 countries. Incidentally, all these companies I highlight here have been chosen only for illustrative purposes, so please be aware that my compliance department will not be happy if you take any of this as an investment advice. We go on here. So next we have 3D printed food. 3D printing has been around for some time, but it's only in recent years that it has started really having a real impact in the food industry. It's already allowing individuals to have more personalized products with tailored nutrients. It also is helping, the enhancement of plant-based meat textures, which is very, very complicated actually to produce. Forecasts for market growth vary, as always, as you can see. This in large part because of the market's relative infancy. So $7.5 billion by 2030 is the most optimistic estimate at present for 3D printing. There are challenges, but they're likely to include really the 3D printing at scale, if you will. But several major players, you look at Nestle, you look at Barilla, are already working on the scalability problem. Israel has been really a trailblazer in this field. For example, Sever Eats uses a combination of 3D printing, synthetic biology to produce meatless products. These are actually cooked by a robot chef according to a customer precise preference and nutritional requirements. Pretty amazing. Similarly, another Israeli company, Stakeholder Foods, that's STEAK, uses 3D printing to produce whole cuts of meat that are personalized to a consumer's specific needs. Hydroponics and aeroponics are two innovative methods of growing crops without soil. Hydroponics instead uses nutrient-rich solution, and aeroponics uses nutrient-rich air. These novel approaches are obviously especially valuable in areas with poor soil quality. They can enable the growth of crops that would otherwise have little chance of surviving. So high yields are also key. For example, hydroponic systems are capable of producing yields up to 25% higher than those achievable with traditional agricultural systems. This is a vital consideration in an age when food demand is increasing, but the impacts of climate change are reducing overall agricultural outputs. As the chart shows, some estimates predict the market for hydroponics and aeroponics could be worth almost $30 billion by the end of the decade. Cubic Farm Systems, it's a Canadian company, is an innovative player in the space. Since 2015, it has been working on systems that are more resilient to the challenges presented by climate change and other environmental issues. One example is hydroponic systems that uses, it's basically one of their systems that uses 95% less water, no pesticides, no herbicides. It's capable of providing really predictable and consistent growing conditions 365 days a year. Next, we have blockchain technology. Blockchain originally served as the technology underpinning cryptocurrency, of course, but we now it has multiple applications beyond that space. Food is one of them. Blockchain can help dramatically improve transparency around the provenance of a food product by detailing every stage of its journey. It can give retailers and consumers a full breakdown of a product's origins, ingredients, nutritional content. We are talking about unprecedented levels of traceability. The immutability of blockchain, the idea that blockchain ledgers cannot be tampered with, is crucial to the concept of traceability. It should build trust in the food supply chain. Concerns about food waste are also expected to fuel greater adaptation of blockchain in the agricultural sector. This should further boost the market's growth. And so what kind of growth are we likely to see during the next few years? As the chart shows, the market is expected to be worth up to $9 billion by 2030. Funding has grown exponentially in recent years, but regulatory uncertainty needs to be addressed if the market is to fulfill its potential. The same can be said for synthetic biology that we touched on earlier. Despite these potential hurdles, some big name businesses have created specialist divisions dedicated really to exploring blockchain's role in transforming the global food system. One is IBM, which has established a division known as IBM Food Trust. One of its most significant partnerships today is with the retailer Carrefour. Using their smartphones, Carrefour shoppers can now scan a QR code on a food product's label or packaging and then immediately access different details about the item. These include data around the harvest, around location of cultivation, when the product was packed, safety tests, certifications, and even tips on preparation. Another major tech business is SAP, of course, from Germany, has set up a logistics business network division. This aims to allow companies to trace multi-ingredient products across company boundaries. Finally, we have wearable technology enabled by AI, artificial intelligence. This market is all about providing real-time insights into an individual's health and well-being. Many of us are already familiar with how wearable AI can help personalize exercise regimes. Going forward, it will also play a bigger role in personalizing dietary and nutritional advice. The wearable AI market is expected to be worth up to 114 million by 2030. You see that here, healthcare related wearables are tipped to experience the fastest growth rate. Some big names are leading the way in this area. One is Bosch, whose SensorTech division is actually developing self-learning AI sensors for wearable devices. Another is Abbott from the US, Abbott Laboratories. It's working on a new category of wearables that tap into a range of personalized trends, including sports nutrition. and Abbott calls these wearables lingo. They will measure glucose, ketones, lactate, to really help consumers make decisions on improving energy, losing weight, enhancing athletic performance. Well, you can see here lots is going on in the sphere of nutrition. This mirrors what's happening in the food sector as a whole, which is undergoing an urgently needed transition. To give you a high-level idea what's involved here, Invesco believes disrupting the global food system is likely to require investments of up to 30 trillion between now and 2050. To put it another way, we need to invest around $1 trillion a year between now and the middle of the century. That's why we regard this as one of the biggest investment themes ever. Another reason why we view this as a major theme is that the journey towards the newly truly sustainable food system is going to bring multiple impacts across multiple sectors. We have seen evidence of that today. It's overly simplistic to frame the future of nutrition purely in terms of food. It should be framed in terms of how it affects multiple aspects of our day-to-day lives. We have also seen today that companies of many different sizes and kinds will have a role to play in this transition. This is another important feature of a major investment theme. If we think back to the growth of the internet or the smartphone, for example, it's worth remembering success was in no way limited to a handful of all-powerful multinationals. Game-changing disruption was instead made possible by a wide variety of what we might call architects and enablers. Think of it like the California gold rush, when some people did the digging and others sold the picks and shovels that made the digging possible. There's one last point I always like to make about this transition. It's a fascinating example of technology's ability to truly improve our lives. Technology's capacity to make our lives easier has never been in doubt, of course, but whether it always makes our lives better is another issue. And if we think of big tech, for instance, that does an advancement to their new iTunes algorithm or a new online war game, does it really make our lives better in the strictest sense? Wouldn't our lives really be better if the transformative power of technology was instead directed towards addressing global challenges? Well, that's what's happening now with nutrition and with the food system in general. So this transformative power of tech is being used as a means of meeting unmet urgent needs. And I hope this presentation has helped illustrate the scale of the opportunities now opening up in the sphere of nutrition and the food sector more widely. My Invesco colleagues and I have written extensively about these matters, not just recently, but ever since we first drew attention to the need to reform the food system several years ago. You may want to check out some of our white papers, including From Sustenance to Sustainability in our Appetite for Change series, all the relevant materials available on Invesco's websites. You're also welcome to contact me at henning.stein@invesco.com. If you have any further questions, that email address should be on the screen right now. Thank you again for joining me today, and I hope you feel your time was well spent in the spirit of investing in nutrition. I wish you health and wealth.
Henning, thank you. Tremendous talk as always, just outstanding. You know, from an investment standpoint, you know, a lot of the charts you had up, when you look at, if you look at the light blue for what today was versus what 10 years out is, it seems like it's almost a no-brainer from an investment standpoint when you think about the potential for returns in this type of area. You know, I'm an old sci-fi fan, so I'm a big fan of the old series Lost in Space in the 1960s.
Right.
And they used to have, I remember all those years ago, they used to have something they called the hydroponic garden. And here you are here you are. One of the game-changing technologies was hydroponics. It's like, hey, look at that.
Science
Erlen
fiction
Allen
becomes science fact, right?
right. That's right. When you look at the common good and you look at all of the fundamentals of what you were talking through on the nutrition side and how transformational is it, when you pull it back and you come back and put your Invesco hat on and asset management for that standpoint, do you ever feel like you have a potential conflict, or do you have to work harder in selling it to, say, from an investment standpoint, the whole concept of transformational nutrition? How do you balance both?
No, not at all. Absolutely not. I think it's extremely counterproductive for investors, business entrepreneurs, to believe this kind of framing somehow lacks a sense of responsibility, right? It's true. People sometimes tell me, approaching these issues through the prism of investment, come up with an agenda, or through the prism of finance, or generally sort of trivializes hugely, important problems. I disagree. I say, I don't see the logic in such arguments. I might even say I find them silly, because the fact is that bringing about positive, lasting change is going to require money, right? So I mentioned earlier that we need to invest $1 trillion a year to reform the food system. We need to invest even more, around $4 trillion a year, to have any hope of achieving targets around net zero, right? That's playing into this, but it's a separate thing. It requires investment into the energy transition. And where are sums like that likely to come from, right? I mean, the money is not going to come from the world's governments, at least not at all of it, right? For the simple reason that they just can't afford it. So much of it will instead come from the private sector. And this is why many investors feel they have a role to play in shaping a sustainable future for the planet and its inhabitants. So it's only right, I think, to see this as a means of investing in a shared future, but it's also entirely realistic to see it as one of the most astonishing growth opportunities in human history.
Do you see it as potentially a dedicated funding source, or could you see it from when you think about it from an investment philosophy standpoint? Would it have to be dedicated in one fund, or could you look at it across a broad base of companies that might have certain elements of transformational nutrition in, say, their day-to-day operations?
That's a great question. I think a lot comes from currently the private sector, so non-listed smaller entities that experiment, that have initial funding that's not accessible through a listed approach. But we also see the bigger players I mentioned moving into that very rapidly, and that becomes then also accessible for retail investors. But ultimately, these kind of developments usually start in private markets, and they require leverage from governments, where governments come in. It's like, you private organization invest $1 billion, we put another 4 billion on top to leverage this. So public-private partnerships are necessary actually to scale this up. And we see some hurdles in that respect, because if you look at places like Italy, where they now receive funding from the government, from the EU, basically, to do transition, they have to first change the legislation to make these public-private partnerships possible. But once this is in place, you really see the scaling up.
Yeah, I mean, governments could be helpful from a framework standpoint. You had also, as one of your macro factors, fertilizer regulations. I would assume that governments probably have played a hand in that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a big factor, and we see that across the board. That requires also a change in the mindset, right? That we see that as a positive rather than something that deteriorates the environment, because there are safe ways in using fertilizers to scale things up.
You mentioned, as part of your remarks as well, the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals, and there are 17 of them. Clearly, nutrition, I would think, would be able to, or transformational nutrition would address multiple numbers of goals. Of course, no poverty is goal number one, and you had mentioned, you had mentioned that as part of your remarks. How do you link the topic itself, and would you see it broadly applied through multiple numbers of the UN goals?
Yeah, it all comes back to the notion of technology's transformative power being used to tackle global challenges. And I like the SDGs because they give you a framework to think about it, that might, enter your thinking, whether you want to explore investment themes, and you could link that to SDG 2, which is zero hunger, SDG 3, good health and well-being. I spoke earlier about the phenomenon of interconnected causality, the idea, for example, that nutrition is linked to food, which in turn is linked to climate change, and so on. So we could also give thought to the SDGs that are expressively geared toward the environment. These include SDG 13, which is climate action, and SDG 6, which is clean water and sanitation. We could also look at SDG 12, which is responsible consumption and production, among other things that taps into considerations such as food waste and food packaging. And we might also think about SDG 8, which is decent work and economic growth. And then, of course, SDG 9, which is industry, innovation, and infrastructure. So they all tie into the same theme, if you will. And ultimately, this is about making food or making food a force for good, right? Improving billions of lives. So it's very much part of what the UN calls a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity, but ultimately comes down in like making it practical and having incentives to invest in those SDGs. But to me personally, they're useful as a framework.
It makes you wonder when you think about the common good, and you referenced the California gold rush, right? The California gold rush really was the individual prospector. What you're doing here with innovative nutrition, really, it's for everyone. It's enabling everyone to kind of take responsibility, look into themselves, and kind of foster that mindset. And even one of your 5 technology keys, the wearable AI. I mean, that's all about people kind of checking in really on themselves, and how am I doing with this, and am I performing along the lines of what my goals might be, and what am I having, and what am I ingesting into my system. And just fascinating.
It is fascinating, yes.
Without a doubt. Well, listen, Henning, thank you for joining us today on One Intelligence. What a fabulous kickoff presentation for us on innovative nutrition. You're always a delight. You do such a great job. We really appreciate all your insights, all your thought leadership. And you're a wonderful speaker and guest. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Glenn. It was a pleasure.
Good seeing you. Have a wonderful holiday season. Take care.
Thank you. You too. Okay. Take care.